healthy. We lived down the road for a while and then we moved. But I really want to thank you as a church this morning for taking such good care of our friends. I said I wouldn't cry, so that's not going to happen. You've loved Debbie and Roger unconditionally, and you've loved Roger through the most difficult time of his life, and you will continue to love Debbie as she journeys through the new season of her life, and for that we are incredibly grateful. Anyhow, this morning we're going to talk about the story of Jonah. And recently I was in Thailand. I tend to wiggle a lot, sorry. I said to Josiah this morning, I don't have a PowerPoint because we're going old school. Because, probably about, 100 years ago I made these. And this is for the story of Jonah. Recently I was in Thailand and I was in Khon Ken's men's prison. I've never been to the men's prison before. I've gone to the women's prison. They're actually side by side. But in the past, only women could go to the women's prison and only men could go to the men's prison. Kind of makes sense, really. But this time we got to go to the men's prison. And it was a little bit different. I mean, obviously, they were all men. But in the men's prison, they have set aside a chapel space. In the women's prison, they just kind of meet anywhere. And so after we'd had this incredible time of worship, and what really stood out to me during that time was the honouring that went on. My friend Jane, she's our senior pastor's wife, we're sitting there, and it's really hot. It's about 42 degrees, and we went in about May, so it was not that warm here. And we were sitting there getting hotter and hotter and hotter. And one of the men got up and adjusted the fan, so it blew only on us. But that meant it didn't blow on them. And I was particularly touched by his thoughtfulness and incredibly grateful. But as I stood, I said, this morning, can you guess what Bible story we might be talking about? And one man sitting to my right, in very, very good English, he understood precisely what I said, Moby Dick! Good story, not the one we're going to tell today. And there was that much emphasis on the last word. And I was like, right. So obviously he'd heard about that story. But I did think, what a bit of a rabbit I was. These people don't know the Bible stories like we do. So this morning we're going to talk about Jonah. And his story obviously begins in Jonah chapter 1. The book is one of the books of the minor prophets. There are 12. But he is the only minor prophet referred to by Jesus, which is fairly significant. Most of us know this story, so bear with me as I turn my incredibly talented pages. The story begins with God telling Jonah to go to Nineveh. He tells him to go to Nineveh and preach against it because its wickedness has come before me. Jonah really didn't want to go to Nineveh. He actually preferred to go to Tarshish. The reason he didn't want to go to Nineveh was because Nineveh was the capital city of the Assyrian Empire. It was a large city, it was prominent, and in Jonah 4 it tells us that it had over 120,000 inhabitants. I shudder to think what the plumbing was like. In fact, historians tell us that it was the largest city in the world at the time. But it was God's plan for Jonah to go to a non-Jewish city and call them to repent. Now, Jonah, of course, had other ideas. He'd heard stories about the Assyrians. When God said Nineveh was wicked, he was not kidding. The Assyrians had a reputation for their cruelty that is beyond measure. Their speciality was brutality of the grossest and most disgusting kind. When their armies captured a city or a country, they did unspeakable atrocities. They quite liked skinning people alive, decapitation, mutilation, removal of tongues, making pyramids out of heads, piercing chins with a rope, and forcing prisoners to live like dogs in kennels. Ancient records from Assyria boast of their cruelty, and they wore it as a badge of honour and power. The Assyrians, of course, had no use for the Jews, and the Jews, well, they hated the Assyrians. They hated them for their idolatry, for their ignorance, and for a Jewish man to go to Nineveh and preach was absolutely repugnant. As far as Jonah was concerned, Nineveh could go to hell, probably the faster the better. So why would he go there? The best that he could hope for was that he would be mocked or treated like a fool. To give us some idea on how Jonah would have felt, it would have been likened to a Jewish man living in New York City during World War II, going to Berlin and telling Nazi Germany to repent. Totally unimaginable. But nothing is impossible. While we may not have a city like Nineveh, there are situations in our lives that can represent Nineveh to us. Maybe we're going through something that we don't want to be going through. Maybe we're afraid of something. Or maybe we find ourselves in a situation that we never imagined that we'd find ourselves in. And we feel like we're in a place where God would never go or ask us to go. Because Jonah didn't want to go there, he couldn't understand how God would really want to save his enemies. But Jesus tells us in Matthew 5, verse 34, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. That's not the kind of justice I prescribed to. Debbie and I were talking, and I said to her, I have quite a good sense of justice. As a child, I couldn't understand about the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia. I actually just thought someone should go in and kill them all and that would solve the problem. I also kind of have that view, kind of think that about Syria at times when I see it on the news. If you're mean to people, you deserve meanness back. Not what Jesus calls us to. May have to do some, alteration in my own thinking. So Jonah decided he was not going to Nineveh. He was going to go to a city go down to Joppa, jump on a boat to Tarshish. Well, Tarshish was the furthest city away that he could think of. He probably hadn't known about Psalm 139, where it says, where can I go from your spirit? Where can I flee from your presence? If I go to the heavens, you are there. If I make my bed in the depths, you are there. If I rise on the wings of the dawn, if I settle on the far side of the sea, even there your hand will guide me, your right hand will hold me fast. No matter where you go, God is there. He is speaking to our hearts. You can't outrun God because he's always there. God was in that boat as they went. Well, when you're running from God, often when you find that place where you think you might be safe, you pop down and have a wee nap. Seemed like a good idea. So Jonah disappears down below deck and he falls into a deep sleep. But we must remember that God stirred up the storm that came. We must remember that Jesus also calmed the storm, and that our decisions that we make in life affect not only ourselves but others around us. Our sins have consequences. Our rebellion against God affects others' lives as well, not only our own. You see, there was Jonah sleeping in the bottom of the ship, while all around him there was a wee storm going on. The poor sailors on top were trying desperately to work out how to survive the storm. It's a curious and tragic scene. All the sailors were devout religious men. They were saying prayers to their God. There was one man on board who had a relationship with the true God and knew his word and worshipped him. And yet where was he? Asleep. And I think of what Charles Spurgeon said when he talked about Jonah. He said, Jonah was asleep in the midst of all the confusion and noise. And O Christian man, for you to be indifferent to all that is going on in such a world as this, for you to be negligent of God's work in such a time as this, is just as strange. The devil alone is making noise enough to wake up all Jonahs if they want to awake. All around us there is turmoil and storm, Yet some professing Christians are able, like Jonah, to sleep in the sides of a ship. Sometimes we can be sleeping in the midst of a storm, and it's time to waken up and change the world that we live in. The sailors cast lots to see who was guilty in making God angry, and the lot fell to Jonah. I actually thought that'd be quite a good idea. If the world's not right, we just cast lots and see whose fault it is. Seems simple. No, okay. And then they asked him, "Who are you? Where do you come from? And what have you done?" When he told them, they were terrified because he was the one who worshipped the God who was the supreme and the maker of heaven and earth. And here they were, going along, being caught in the storm. Jonah says, "Throw me overboard. I'm the guilty one. Get rid of me and you'll be safe. I know it's my fault that the storm has come upon you." But the men don't want to. They didn't want to compound their problem by killing one of God's prophets, even if he was the disobedient one. So they tried to sail to shore, but the storm got worse. They had no choice, so they cried to God and said, "Please, Lord, don't let us die for taking this man's life." Then they took Jonah and they threw him overboard. When he landed in the sea grew calm and the storm died down and the waves were still. When the sailors saw that, they immediately feared God and they sacrificed to God and made vows to him. These men who worshipped and served other gods knew nothing of the one true God and yet were drawn to him because of the imperfect testimony of one of his followers. God uses even our mistakes, even our failures, our stumblings, even our sin to bring him glory. Now Jonah was out there in the dark water, left to die. Here he is, floating around. God provided an unusual way of rescuing him. He was swallowed by a big fish or a whale. Let's not get hung up on which it was, because the Hebrew word dag and the Greek word ketos are a generic term that apply to any aquatic creature. It was big enough to swallow a man. Now, many people find it hard to believe that the book of Jonah could be taken seriously because they don't believe that a man could be swallowed by a whale and live to tell the story. Well, the following account of a modern day man, not quite sure how modern this man was really, who underwent a similar experience. It was recorded in the Princeton Theological Review, Volume 25, year 1927. And it's on page 636 if you'd like to go and check. And it says, in February 1881, the whaling ship Star of the East was in the vicinity of the Falkland Islands and sighted a large sperm whale 3 miles away. 2 boats were launched. One of the boats attacked the whale, but with a lash of its tail, the boat was upset. 1 man drowned, and the other man, James Bartley, disappeared. The whale was killed and pulled to the side of the ship, where the crew with axes and spades removed blubber. They worked all day and part of the night. The next morning they removed the stomach and hoisted it onto the deck. The sailors then were startled when amongst the contents of the stomach they found the missing sailor, doubled up and unconscious. He was laid on the deck and washed down with seawater, which revived him. Healing power in seawater. He remained 2 weeks a raving lunatic. At the end of the 3rd week, he had entirely recovered from the shock and resumed his duties. I do wonder if that meant he went out in another boat. He later recounted his experience of being swallowed and being inside the stomach, where he could easily breathe, but the heat was terrible. His skin was exposed to gastric juices. His face and neck and hands were bleached to a deadly whiteness and never fully recovered to their normal appearance. That's true cosmetic surgery. Otherwise, his health did not seem affected by his terrible experience. Jonah spent 3 days and 3 nights in that great fish. And what does he do while he's there? While Jonah was there, he was praying. Why would Jonah thank God and praise God for being fish food? When you read his prayer, he doesn't mention the fish. He's thanking God for saving him from death. He's thanking God for allowing him to still be alive. He had every right to be judged and condemned by God. Jonah directly disobeyed God, but God was merciful, and Jonah sees this as a second chance. We too can be thankful of the second chances, or the many, many second chances that we've been given. God never condemns us. He's always there, ready to forgive us. Sometimes I do wonder if Jonah was still thankful after being vomited up on a beach. And I wonder too how his first bath felt. Probably quite pleasant. When Jonah gets his second chance, and God once again instructs him to go to Nineveh and proclaim the message I gave you. This time Jonah obeys, and he tells those living there that in 40 days Nineveh will be overthrown. 40 days until judgment comes. The people declare a fast. Even the king proclaims that everyone is to seek God and to turn from their wicked ways. And hopefully God will have mercy, and there's a citywide repentance. I imagine if a white man, a bleached, caustic soda-y white man with amazing cosmetic surgery turns up in your city and declares something like that, you probably are going to listen. It was a citywide revival. God used a prophet to bring revival to a land and turn his enemies back to God. God withheld his judgment and had compassion on them. Now, you would kind of think that Jonah would be ecstatic about this. But he wasn't. He was actually quite disappointed because his sense of justice was a bit like mine. They didn't get what they deserved. And we don't get what we deserve with Jesus. And Jonah prayed to the Lord and he said, "Isn't this what I said, Lord, when I was still at home? That is what I tried to forestall by fleeing to Tarshish. I knew you were gracious. I knew you were a compassionate God, slow to anger, abounding in love, a God who relents from sending calamity. Now, God, take away my life. It is better for me to die than live." Jonah was really upset because they didn't get what he thought they deserved. He knew God was merciful. He knew God would have compassion and forgive rather than strike them down. He just knew it. It figures. It's why he didn't want to go there in the first place. Does Jonah remember the mercy that God had on him? Does he remember being saved from his watery grave? Does he remember God's forgiveness? Sometimes we are like Jonah. We forget the forgiveness that we have in our own lives. We forget that there were so many things that could have happened to us, but God's forgiveness is free and available. And maybe we don't live in a society where we really understand the consequences of what we may term little sins. But when I was in prison with these men, they had a sense of freedom that I thought that I lacked in my own life, because they understood how forgiven they were. Not only were they forgiven of what they had done, but they were forgiven of the blight of the way that their society judges them. They were new creatures. See, God has compassion of all, no matter where we live or what we do. And recently, I was asked to do a communion message. Excuse me while I pick up. I'll do that in a minute. Yes.
Sorry, just a little bit of communicating on the run. So we're actually going to watch just a video, and it has words to it, and it's a time for us just to think about what the words are saying, to meditate on them, to dwell on them, to listen to them, and then Angela's going to come back and talk a little bit about communion.